You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Ben Wilson to talk about his most recent book, Urban Jungle, The History and Future of Nature in the City. We chat about how plants took root in the rubble of wars and blank spaces, and how cities could be more circular and sustainable. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our wonderful, amazing Patreon supporters. Your support is critical to Talking Headways and Mondays at the Overhead Wire. We really appreciate it. To join this gang of zoning misfits and transportation rabble-rousers, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you some stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scarves. Thanks so much to everybody who supports the show, from the bus drivers to the advocates all around the world. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. And for more information on our work and where to find our daily newsletter, the transportation scarves, our Cars Are Cholesterol merch, buy books from the authors that join us on the show at our bookshop affiliate site, or find our audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's Town Planning and Practice, check out the show notes on your podcatcher or visit theoverheadwire.com. Well, Ben Wilson, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Lovely to be with you. It's a delight.
Awesome. Well, thanks for being here. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I've always been passionate about history. So history has taken me on a kind of really interesting journey through my life. I've been lucky to work for myself, to take my passion for history, which I kind of developed probably when I was about 5 years old, and to really write history, I think, for the general public, for people who are curious about the world, and to follow the things that I'm personally interested in, because that's where my passion comes from, to be inspired by the things that I like, and hopefully communicate that to as wide an audience as possible. Always curious about the world, always finding new and interesting ways to write about history. So I've covered quite a broad range in my writing career. I studied history at university, and I've never had a job, which is a sort of kind of an amazing thing. And always written, and always found one way or another to communicate with the world as a writer. Lived most of my life, all my life in the UK, but traveled widely to lots of cities. You know, that's become a sort of passion in my more recent writing career, is to write about cities and urban issues. So I've been around the world, and I've studied in places like Lagos, Nigeria. I've been to Mumbai. Various places in the United States. I've kind of tried to sort of bring a sense of place to my writing. So it's been an interesting life. I enjoy a lot, and there's always a new strand to pull on. And I guess the most recent one has been to marry an interest in ecosystems with an interest in history as well, and an interest in cities. So I'm trying to sort of bring all those things together, and that's what I meant earlier about trying to find new ways to write about history. And quite a sort of fresh and an interesting way to write about history now is to try and sort of look at history in a kind of ecological sense, or look at how much we've used ecosystems, because a lot of the time I think traditional history kind of ignored that, or didn't bring it into it so much. But we live at a time where our own concerns with climate and the environment is so pressing on us that it's interesting to look back at the past on those terms.
Was there an inflection point in your writing, or at least in your career as a writer looking at history, that you started to see cities as this kind of connective tissue between all the things that you were thinking about? Or was it something that was interesting to you early on when you were younger or a kid?
Well, I was born in London, didn't live there all my life, but I kind of found it and really got embedded in the layers of history in London when I lived there in my 20s. Always walked everywhere, kind of discovered the byways and connections and all those kind of, the way that history is like a layer, is like a sort of visual archaeology that you can kind of trace and put together. So I think, and I was writing a lot about people who lived in cities. In one book I wrote about, in the mid-19th century, I wrote about the kind of connections that were developing in the world through things like the invention of the telegraph and the big sort of technological changes that came across the world. And that's really what led me into more specifically urban history, because what I was becoming interested in was these interconnections between people, where history is made, where connections are made, where kind of innovation happens. So cities seemed a very good way to locate those changes, where people come together and innovate, and where ideas are generated and sparked, and that kind of curious alchemy that happens in cities. It's the way that the unexpected happens. That'd always been a sort of part of my writing. When I wrote about Georgian London and print writers and subversive radical satirists and writers, and the way they interacted in cities was always kind of intriguing to me. But to do that more explicitly has become something, I guess, that I came to. And I thought, it is informed about what's going on in the world as well. I was kind of conscious I was writing at a time when the world was urbanizing very quickly. There was a huge kind of revolution going on, but a kind of, it seemed in some ways sort of disconnected with the past. So to bring back an idea of how cities functioned, what cities, the sort of possible, the sort of myriad kind of infinite possibilities that happen in cities at a time when I thought that, in a way, our cities were becoming much more constrained and we were losing a sense of the kind of the face-to-face kind of interactions in cities, the kind of joy that cities can bring, that they were becoming far too much places of kind of outrageous growth and kind of economic change, that actually bringing back the kind of human dimension, what makes cities pleasurable, seemed to me before COVID, really.
Well, that's another question I have is like how the pandemic impacted your love or your interest in cities and some of the things that changed over that period of time. I mean, your first book, Metropolis, came out kind of right as it was taking off the pandemic.
Bang in the middle of it. When really what I'd written about was, it was in the background of a lot of sort of hype about cities as being, that we would become a fully urbanized species. More than 50% of people have become city dwellers in about, let's say, 2010. It was around about then. No one knows exactly when that happened. And there was a kind of urban-led kind of renaissance going on. The urbanization of China, for instance, was huge. The way that a city I was particularly interested in, probably the city that of all places kind of led me to writing about cities as places where history could be told, was Shanghai, which, in the late 80s, early 1990s was a real sort of smoggy backwater. And for lots of reasons, it had been kind of sidelined by the Chinese Communist Party because it had been a place that had connected with the rest of the world and had been a source of radicalism, of political instability, but it then became the kind of symbol of Chinese modernity. And I found it, that Shanghai kind of represented in a way a kind of, you could tell a history of the world almost from Shanghai, from a time when it was sort of more or less dominated by the Western powers and sort of carved up between them, and then became a place of resistance, a very cosmopolitan place between the wars, and then a site of the beginnings of the Second World War, and then the beginnings, in more subsequent times of China's opening up to the world, and a kind of aggressive urbanization, which has been exported and shapes city skylines around the world, the way that Shanghai consciously kind of took on a kind of skyline. So I was writing in that background, a place where there was a lot of kind of excitement about cities. There was a sort of talk about exporting the Chinese model to African cities. So all this was very consequential. And then a talk about, that our future was urban and that a few sort of global superstar cities were sort of having a kind of disproportionate power in the world, whether it was a sort of Silicon Valley kind of urban ideal or whether it was a big city like Lagos in Nigeria, which was, sucking in huge amounts of people and really kind of sparking an urban renaissance. And so I went to those places. I went to all, lots of places like that, the kind of the slums of Mumbai, or the kind of like a pioneering city like Singapore, and tried to sort of, blend together all those things and to relate them to history. And the things I was celebrating was the kind of the way that cities bring people together, and it's exciting. And then as it came out, COVID happened. So a lot of the stuff that I was talking about and celebrating, the antithesis was happening, that we, rather than coming together, we were being asked to stay apart, and cities became kind of inversions of everything that I was saying. So I kind of hoped when the book came out that it was a reminder of a more hopeful time that people could read when they were sort of stuck and imprisoned in cities, that a reminder of the sort of the face-to-face, the markets, cafes, town squares, all the places where that kind of urban interaction had manifested itself in the past, was something that when we were thinking about rebuilding cities after the pandemic, hopefully those were things that could inspire people to rethink, that urban life should be about pleasure and innovation and the sparking generation of ideas and the coming together of people, as they have been throughout history, that maybe in a way of rebuilding cities after pandemics and their aftermaths of people working from home, a kind of flight from the city, that there was something still valuable about cities, that we still need them, and we still need them more than ever. I think, history has always sort of happened in cities, hasn't it? Those ideas, those fast interactions of ideas, the collision of ideas, the collisions of people, the bringing together of people from different backgrounds, the reinvention of people's lives and lifestyles in an urban environment is still really important. And we shouldn't forget that in an age where we are working more remotely and being disconnected, that cities are hugely pleasurable places. They're hugely interesting places. The way that the sort of the human ant heap kind of emerges over time. Cities have really, really interesting histories, and they change very quickly. And that was, even a city like Los Angeles, which I was kind of in my kind of tour of world cities, was the one I thought would maybe have the least history, but actually I was kind of obsessed by history when I went to Los Angeles. And even though I said, going around London where history is very obvious, in Los Angeles it isn't so obvious because it keeps reinventing itself. But you don't need to know much about Los Angeles or particular bits of Los Angeles to sort of realize how quickly the turnover of history has been, and how, things like geopolitics, the history of the Cold War, history of race relations are all sort of, can be told from sort of unique little sort of bits of the city. And just a drive, a city like Los Angeles, we have to drive around. I'm more used to walking around cities. Kind of an automobile-based safari around the city kind of is, if you bring a historical consciousness to it, it's hugely interesting. So all cities have that, and all districts of cities, all bits have their own unique little histories or big histories or microcosms of histories that we should value. And they all sort of tell us something about ourselves. And at a time when we were kind of sharply kind of bending away from cities, from that kind of, idea, confidence and sort of swagger of cities, that, there was something that we should go back to. And that coincided also with thinking about cities which is the subject of my more recent book, which is the way that cities and their ecosystems are going to be very, very important to how they develop in the future.
Yeah, well, let's talk about your book, Urban Jungle, The History and Future of Nature in the City. I want to know what your relationship is with nature and the actual urban environment. We often talk about the urban environment as kind of the place where we live, including all the concrete and everything else, but it also includes the plants and the nature that lives in the city. So I'm wondering what your relationship is with the urban environment more generally.
There's lots of ways to answer that question, but my personal relationship, I guess, is that having been a city dweller, the sort of discovery of going around the corner and finding a patch of wild vegetation or an ancient tree or a sort of leftover bit that wasn't built on is kind of remarkable, I think. And, I'd sort of got very obsessed with the kind of the human aspects of cities. But what I kind of found when I was writing and researching the book was that the nature in the cities is a mirror of our kind of activities. That these are very unique urban ecosystems that develop in cities, and they're not natural in the sense that there's a sort of primeval nature that exists beneath the concrete or in sort of unused patches. But the seeds that come to the city, the way that nature responds to us, is the sort of historical dimension I wanted to bring to this book, because the history that I celebrate about the emergence and development and the kind of evolution of social and sort of architectural evolution of a city is really, it finds its counterpart in the natural world, which is easily overlooked. And so my relationship with it has changed significantly by writing it. But I notice much more because almost the eye is trained to look away from the vegetation and look towards the human and the kind of the buildings, the activity, the way that people relate to each other, that you almost sort of step over and ignore something that's equally remarkable, which I'm sure we'll talk about, which is the way that nature can thrive in cities, but also be really, really surprising. And as I say, charting the history of nature in the cities was not looking at a static thing, but it was looking at something that was very, very dynamic, So my relationship to it is that, it's an exercise in noticing and looking, and also history of kind of knowing where are the origin points of some of the plants that grow in cities. How did they get there? What are they doing there? That's all very, very intriguing to me. And so, my relationship has changed significantly. The kind of plants I value in cities has sort of shifted a bit from seeing nature as sort of incidental to actually seeing it now as something that has been and still is something that city dwellers need, not just for their recreation, but for their kind of protection from climate and climate change, and the way that, it's a defensive part of cities as much as it is an aesthetic and sort of beautiful part of cities.
I've noticed since I read the book that I have been noticing plants that I might not have otherwise noticed, or actually plants that I did notice, but I thought that they were weeds, right?
Yeah.
They're something that is just not insidious. That's not the word I'm looking for, but just like they're everywhere.
Yeah.
And I don't think they're a native species to San Francisco, but there's this one plant that seems to get into every crack, every area around my house and all up the street. But I know that nobody's planted it, and it's not, it's something that people usually rip out if they get a chance. I had noticed that before, but I noticed even more after reading the book. And I appreciate that, because I think it's interesting to rethink your city every once in a while and see it in a different light, especially as it relates to nature. You have an interesting story about weeds in the book. And I was wondering if when you were doing the research for the book, is this something that you expected to, find out more about, was weeds and the definition of weeds and what we think of as weeds? And that word is just it's so loaded, right?
Really loaded. Yeah. I mean, I gave a talk recently in the city of Bath in England, which, most people will know of if they've seen any kind of costume drama of this kind of elegant, beautiful Georgian city, the epitome of kind of the politeness of the 18th century. A city I knew because my grandmother used to live there, so I knew it as a child, but I hadn't really been back much before I gave this talk. And before I gave the talk, I wandered around the streets, and there were lots and lots of what we would call weeds growing. When I gave my talk, I said to the people of Bath who had come along to the talk, why have you got so many weeds? And I kept correcting myself and saying they're not weeds, it's spontaneous vegetation. You shouldn't call it weeds because weeds is so loaded, but spontaneous vegetation is the stuff that's allowed to grow there. This beautiful city had amazing diversity. Its biodiversity was incredible in kind of the things that were growing up amongst these kind of very, very elegant Georgian buildings. And one of the reasons I asked my audience was, why do you have so much? Are you very permissive? Or do you just spend all your time looking at the buildings and not at the pavement? and no one was able to quite answer the question. But yes, I think that the idea of weeds, spontaneous vegetation, was something that I didn't know an awful lot about. I'd always seen as maybe a bit of a nuisance, or I'd seen people ripping them out. But what I kind of discovered in the book, I mean, so the history of this and where the starting point for my interest was what happened during the Second World War in European and Asian cities, was amongst the sort of huge destruction, especially in European cities, lesser degree in Britain, although parts of London and other cities were hit quite badly. Was that what people noticed was the huge amount of vegetation growing back very, very quickly on the rubble. And it wasn't the vegetation that people expected to find. So one example was when London burnt down in 1666, it was covered by a kind of species of rocket that was called London rocket. And that wasn't seen at all 200 years or so later during the Blitz, that there was a whole new plant species. There was plants that would you normally find in the highlands of Scotland or on the slopes of Mount Etna, or in Peru, or in mountainside. Similar thing in Berlin. There was a whole species of plants that were adapted to rocky Mediterranean shores was suddenly popping up in Berlin, and all kinds of other species. So where did they come from? So some, in the case of Britain, some of those spontaneous vegetation had followed the railway lines from Scotland. They'd adapted themselves to sort of harsh rocky terrain, and they'd found this sort of super highway that took them into the city. They'd escaped from gardens, they'd escaped from parks, and made their way to either from the city or had made their way into the city. They came on the turn-ups of men's trousers. They came in the nose bags of horses that came to clear away the rubble. They came in the treads of tires. So what that told people, and when people began to look at the history, was that throughout all time, seeds had come into the city through, our activities, through our love of novelty, of bringing, plants from around the world and putting them in cities, and they kind of jump the fence, as it were, and arise spontaneously. And what, this sort of fixed people's notice on cities. Oh, and another very good example was a species of plant that arrived in Berlin, a kind of a steppe vegetation that had come with the Red Army, with the Ukrainian cavalry that arrived in Berlin carrying their seeds incidentally. And suddenly you get tumbleweed outside the sort of the main railway station in West Berlin, which is still there. And then other species that saw the destruction, the piles of rubble, they were perfectly adapted. This was a great opportunity for them. And then in London, you get species of birds that come to London in the Blitz that had never been seen in London before, because suddenly there was this kind of whole rocky landscape that they could exploit. And now that was very, very vivid to people because they wanted to see a recovery, signs of a recovery at a dreadful time. But this was something that had been happening over the millennia, really, in cities, was that trade and things like that had brought all kinds of seeds into the city, germinated there, seeds that were kind of the disaster-loving seeds that kind of adapted to the results of forest fires or cliffs or salt marshes or whatever like that, found cities a kind of very hospitable place. The idea of urban ecology really began in Berlin, West Berlin, during the Cold War, when West Berlin was sealed off. And there were a lot of rubble sites that hadn't been cleared away. Places like London, they were cleared away and built on quite quickly. In Berlin, lots of empty space was left. They were called bracken. And so you could see the development of an ecosystem in these places and a turnover of species. And so one of the heroes of my book is a chap called Herbert Zukup, who was a biologist in West Berlin. Normally, ecologists would go out into the countryside or things like that, but they had very little chance in West Berlin. So they turned inwards and looked at what was going on in this bracken, the fallow fields, and found a diversity of species in the city growing spontaneously that far exceeded parks and actually far exceeded the local countryside. These were species that were non-native to that part of Germany, but we're kind of happily, merrily exploiting these empty spaces and creating these hugely valuable ecosystems with rare plants, plants you didn't find anywhere else, the insect populations, the bees, the butterflies, and things like that, these very important pollinators. We're having a great time in these sites. You don't have to have your city bombed for this to happen. There are so many waste sites in cities, empty spaces, gaps between buildings, gaps between uses, where actually this nature was flourishing everywhere. It wasn't just in the damage. That was simply that it gave it prominence. It gave it a kind of a reason to study it. But actually, once you turn the gaze onto cities as an ecologist, you find a very high species turnover. As the human population grows, you find more species. All these things seem counterintuitive, that the bigger and more densely sort of used and populated a city becomes, it actually manifests a huge degree of nature. And these places whereas parks, the acres of grass, very manicured and sort of grown for ornamental reasons, where nature sort of flourished best is the cracks in the concrete. It could be between, paving stones in sidewalks, along roads, on railway lines, alongside roads, in those empty spaces. And actually, what I sort of found that an American city, a city in the United States, will have between about 10 and 25% of its land at any one time will be wasteland, as there's a cycle of growth of building and destruction and rebuilding. And it's in these sites that actually, they're huge. They're bigger than often the public parks. And that's where nature's to be found, where there's a huge amount of incredible biodiversity. So whether it's in more formal places like backyards and gardens that people have created, or in the wastelands, that actually cities have this huge amount of biodiversity, which is not just there, but it's interesting because those seeds are there for a reason, and they do sort of chart and follow our changing habits, our tastes, the way we trade, the way that we build, so that all that I think was really, really interesting. Now I walk through cities, and this has been a recent feature of, I think, cities in the UK and continental Europe, is to mow less in public spaces, to change your aesthetics, because once upon a time, and still is, that people see spontaneous vegetation as very messy. I've noticed that there's a beginning of a change in attitude. It's not there completely, but there's a beginning of a change, of a more permissive idea of nature, a change in aesthetics to kind of value sort of messy spaces as places of life, not of dereliction. But they're habits that are really hard to change, because people tend to see those kind of spontaneously occurring species as signs of dereliction and people not caring, and maybe of social breakdown. But look at it a different way, and they become they should be sort of places that are cherished to a certain extent, and cherished partly because they are temporary. That sort of the sort of remorseless nature of the city, of the building and rebuilding, means they're not there for very long. But while they are there, the species that can emerge are incredible and incredibly diverse and really, really surprising. And so if you approach it as a historian, ask why those species are there, then cities become actually really interesting places ecologically. You don't have to go out into the countryside or to a national park or to an area of wilderness to actually find a kind of wilderness on your doorstep.
There was a really interesting Twitter exchange, maybe a couple of weeks ago or last week. There was somebody who I guess is very formal, wants very rigid and orderly neighborhoods, and they saw one of their neighbors, I guess, or somebody in their neighborhood's house was overgrown with plants. And they said, this is why we need homeowner associations, which in the United States, they can govern how you mow your lawn and those types of things. And it turns out that, from my understanding anyways, that the person whose house that was a biologist who had let their garden grow because they understood the importance of pollinators and those types of things. So it's like this very intense reaction and understanding of what is needed, but also how people feel about their urban environments, and what they crave in terms of order or not is another matter.
Yeah, totally. And I think, American cities used to be, especially in their period of kind of very, very tumultuous growth in the 19th century, did have a lot of leftover space, and had a lot of, depending on the region, lots of spontaneous vegetation, sort of a lot marked by sunflowers, maybe. They were big kind of things, lots of prairie type plants that were growing in cities, lots of kind of imports from Europe and things like that. Hugely kind of beautiful, but also ugly. Beautiful if you're a biologist, ugly if you're a sort of homeowner. And the government of the environment of the American urban environment by weed ordinances is a kind of interesting story of a kind of very sharp and sudden change in attitudes, and an association with plants that grow spontaneously as kind of like sort of the dregs of the plant life were kind of mirrored the sort of dregs of the human life, that they were kind of camping out on waste ground. And it was very, very kind of pejorative terms, very kind of associating weeds with an ill-governed city, and then a kind of very rigorous policing of suburbia as it developed, and a kind of sort of an aspirational thing to have the perfect lawn, to have a well-ordered garden, and to keep up with the Joneses, but also a fear of kind of offending local authorities and people that could really come down hard on you if you didn't sort of maintain your property very well. But if gardens, backyards are a huge contributor to the urban ecosystem. Open space is enormous in the urban environments. It's very, gardens are very important, and how they're managed. Whether people change their attitudes is very different. But the legal case that kind of established it was a chap called John Galt, who was a lawyer in St. Louis, Missouri, and he when he took it to the state Supreme Court, the argument against him growing, spontaneous vegetation was that it was ugly. He said it's not; it's the source of life. We are all dependent on this. But he was still ordered to cut it down, and that case is the precedent for enforcing weed ordinances. But again, it's a change of fashion. There are plenty of garden designers in the United States who are arguing against that suburban aesthetic and trying to make gardens look and feel and be much more biodiverse. Whether that catches on is a hugely different matter, but it's sort of about education, I think. And how do you tend to your garden is really important. It's a lot about ideology. It's a lot about fashion, and it's quite heavily politicized, really, and do you go out into your garden? Do you appreciate it as a space that's well ordered, a kind of part of, which does have a long history in cities of kind of controlling and taming nature and bending it to your will? Or do you look at it as a source of life and so take pleasure in the bees that are out there? Who's that backyard for? I think is the question you have to ask you, and then ask very seriously, because and this is another sort of thing that I kind of discovered writing the book, was that the countryside can be very impoverished biologically speaking, because we spray crops, manage that very heavily, but those pressures don't exist in cities so much. The need to put down pesticides and weed killers, it just isn't there in the same way that it is in the countryside, where you have to grow a lot of crops. Depending sort of how you manage and deal with the land is important. And I think we forgot for a long time the contribution that cities could make to biodiversity, especially as cities have sprawled and grown so much and encroached on so much countryside, that actually, what do you give back? What should you give back? These are all political questions. They're all moral questions, and it's a question of how we answer them. I answer them one way, which is to encourage spontaneous vegetation, but I totally appreciate how much that offends other people, and how the preferences for other people is hugely different. And it's not a question of forcing it on people. I don't think it's a question of education. And I think what I'm trying to do in the book is to talk about how cities were very much in the past connected to their ecosystems and were sort of wilder, messier places. And it's kind of quite a recent thing that we've had this desire to tidy them up and to spray and cut and trim and hack back the vegetation, and to ask why that is, and how we can in the future change that if we wanted to, and if we valued that as an important contribution to increasing biodiversity. For some people it's a no-brainer, for other people it's a much longer process to sort of come to terms with that and accept that the cities can look and feel a different way.
You mentioned kind of the further fields and crops and those types of things, and the symbiotic relationship between cities and the hinterlands. And I found this chapter and specific portion of your book about night soil very interesting, about the kind of symbiotic relationship between people and how they're fed. And this excrement harvesting, night soil, the movement to take what was seen as waste and use it to grow, makes me feel like American cities didn't do things correctly.
But not just American cities. Yes, a lot of what I'm writing about in the book is about how cities were very much once dependent on their immediate ecosystem or on their hinterlands, how over time we came to manage the flow of water, the production of food, the use of trees, the use of fuel, all those things were moved further and further away from the city. So cities almost appeared to float away in their own little bubble, a self-contained sort of very human-based, a human world that was detached from nature. And that is particularly relevant when it comes to food and food production, that for a long time, the richest agricultural land was on the edges of cities, because cities produce a lot of nutrients in the form of excrement, whether it's human or animal. At the time when cities were powered by horses, the amount of manure that was produced was prodigious. It was huge. New York was called the dung heap of the universe. And Brooklyn was the farm. It was the farm of New York, was one of the most agriculturally rich places in the entire United States. It produced a vast amount of proportion of the vegetables for the United States in a very small area, because it had nutrients from a small area. Paris was famous as a place of market gardens that could produce vegetables all year round, of vegetables and fruits, and then and feed the whole of Paris and export it to London, because it had so much. Kind of amazed Londoners that you could get melons in bizarre times of the year, and salads at Christmas and what have you, because they worked their land. Very, very small bits of Paris, they worked very hard with all the dung that was being produced by the horses that produced it, and that system collapsed as soon as motorized vehicles came along. Similarly, in Chinese, Japanese cities, landlords would export urine and human excrement, and it was part of the kind of rental agreement with tenants, that they had this kind of this golden juice, as they called it, that was taken not very far to the edge of the city, made fit by processes that made them able to use it as very fresh fertilizer. And we're talking, this was the system that worked in the case of Japan probably right up to the beginning of the 20th century, and in China until relatively recently, right, really recently. The collection of night soil, as it's politely called, was a huge business and was hugely important. There was a slogan in China in the 50s of, city workers get to work and help with our harvest. So yeah, that's a symbol, I think, of a symbiotic relation that cities kind of contain within them and produce more nutrients than anywhere else in the world, whereas a lot of it is flushed away and then becomes a problem. And this was an argument of Marxists in the 19th century and beyond, was this kind of waste, this big turning of a circular system into a linear one of kind of consumption and expulsion in the form of pollution. And that still happens. I don't know what it's like in the United States, but in my country, there's a huge scandal of the amount of sewage which is continually poured into rivers, causing huge ecological destruction and destruction of people's pleasures who want to use and swim in rivers and beaches. It's a massive, massive problem, and sort of symbolizes that kind of, the cities have went from being kind of having a circular things in terms of food and water and all kinds of things, to being ones of, of consumption and expulsion on sort of gargantuan scales. And that is a problem, and it is one that is a problem of particularly modernity and industrialization, but it's one that of some cities in the world are taking very seriously, such as Amsterdam, which has plans for a totally circular economy, where the city uses and reuses, recycles, uses nutrients, puts it back into agriculture, becomes much more self-sufficient in terms of energy and production, consumption, all those kind of things, that it becomes, going towards the idea of zero waste and a totally sort of circular economy. Whether that's possible or not, it's a different matter, but it's certainly a return to how cities kind of used to be in all kinds of ways. One interesting kind of aspect of that I was kind of interested in the book was that cities once were surrounded by forests, because that was the source of fuel and building materials. And so cities needed to be belted with a huge amount of forest. Now, as soon as, the first country that really moved away from that kind of model of urbanization, city plus forest, was the United Kingdom, that started exploiting coal on a very, very vast scale from the 16th, 17th century onwards, and then just simply cut all the trees down. Whereas cities on continental Europe were dependent on timber as a source of fuel and building materials way into the 19th century. So had big state-managed or municipally managed forests on their peripheries, which still to a certain extent exist now as a kind of wonderful sort of contrast between city and forest.
They're very well manicured and managed too.
And they're well managed, yeah.
And I was in Heidelberg, and I used to run track and cross country, and went across from the Schloss, and there was this trail, and it goes through the forest, and I was like, there are no leaves on the ground, there's no twigs or anything. It's like very manicured, but it's a beautiful place. There's a trail that goes through there, but I was just amazed at the forest management of the place in Heidelberg. It was just crazy.
Yeah, well, the forest is very central to the German imagination, and they were lucky that they kind of fell in love with forest as a place of sort of leisure as they were falling out of use as a source of timber. So they stayed in municipal hands. But the point I'm trying to illustrate is just how much cities, and it is symbolized by agriculture and food production, that the cities were, urban agriculture was a big part of cities, like going back to Los Angeles, up until just after the end of the Second World War and the beginning of being able to transport food over vast distances and things like that. Los Angeles was a city of farms, a huge amount, 25,000 farms of varying sizes within its limits, and produced all its own food. And that wasn't unusual for cities to produce food so closely and so nearby, and to circulate, nutrients. So we've moved away from that, relatively recently, I'd say. And that kind of detachment of cities from their local environment is a big story of urbanization, really, and one that's not always told, I don't think, when we think about cities in their evolution. So that was one I was keen to tell, and to relate it to sort of issues we have in the present, which is the future sustainability of cities and the role they can play, and to see it as a sort of historical process, a thing of historical interest, and that the history does have something to tell us, that we can manage cities in a way that they were managed once before, in a much more sort of environmental sense. That our idea, I think, came along that we could engineer our way out of problems. And I think in an age of increasing floods and increasing temperatures, that our engineering is simply not enough, that we have to go back. Now, where once we needed the forests for fuel and building materials, we now need the trees to protect us from higher temperatures and from floods. And we need rivers in the same way that rivers were once sort of, protective and sort of vital life sources, and then got kind of pushed underground or marginalized or turned into sewers, that actually they all sort of, and those rivers and wetlands and things like that, things that were sort of erased from the kind of Promethean urban experiment, where we kind of thought we could go to learn. And we were going much more back towards those ideas that the trees are regulators of temperature, that rivers and wetlands that were kind of engineered away, in cities all over the world, actually now, learning to live with water and excess water in cities is a really kind of important thing. And that means, to a certain extent, renaturalizing the landscape. There's pioneering American cities like Philadelphia, which is kind of transforming the hard surface into much softer, more rugged, natural sort of water catchment areas, so it doesn't go pouring straight into the sewage system or flooding houses, that it becomes a much more idea of a sponge city, where sort of the natural sort of hydrology, or kind of restored or artificial natural hydrology, as paradoxical as that sounds, becomes once again a kind of important way that cities kind of exist within their environment and interact with their kind of ecosystem. So it's interesting. We're kind of doing it because we're kind of almost being forced into it. But I think that's kind of almost how cities operate, that cities are very adaptive, and they're very adaptive to outside threats. So I kind of expect to see a kind of more of a trend going back towards using nature more in cities. You see it in cities that are very kind of advanced in this and anticipated the effects of climate change very early, like Singapore, which began it in the 1990s, or Dutch cities, which combine an amazing livability, a kind of a walkability, cyclability within cities, a density within urban cores, but with a way of managing water and bringing nature back into cities. They show how that can be done. It's not a utopian kind of idea. It's a very practical idea and a very kind of worthwhile thing. And it has a kickback. It does, having more vegetation and appreciation for vegetation, and it makes cities a nicer place to be, and it's one example is the sidewalks, the kind of the verges in Australian cities take up 7% publicly owned land. It's 7% of the city. It's huge for things around the sides of roads and roundabouts and intersections along the sides of roads by people's houses. So neglected land was always mown, and now there's kind of competitions for who can grow the most sustainable drought-resistant plants, and they look beautiful. They make streets a much more pleasant place to be, and so do trees. And it's a sort of tragedy that cities in Asia and in places like India, which were once famous for being kind of cities that were they integrated some dense urbanism with trees, are being cut down, in a kind of race for modernity, and against the wishes of the people who actually use vegetation as a resource for food and medicines and things like that, and for shade. That these cities that were once famous for their trees are being denuded of trees with huge kind of ecological consequences, with peaking temperatures, with sandstorms that come in, floods and things like that. It's, you see the dangers once you strip away nature, that nature was a resource. When we stop seeing it as a resource and purely as ornamentation, then we lose that connection with it as a vital, living and important, corollary of urban living, and a kind of necessary one as well. You see that being played out. You see good news stories and bad news stories, but all of them underline the kind of the importance of having nature in cities, of having some sort of accommodation between what we value about cities, which is often their density, the kind of the activity of human life, but the kind of huge amount of space that cities create for nature that we don't utilize. There's acres and acres of flat roofs which are terribly underutilized, which also help with preventing flooding, retaining water, but also with regulating the temperature within buildings. It's a huge kind of thing that's out there, that's vast amounts of underutilized urban space. So I think that's one thing that also kind of I came to realize when I was writing the book, and I kind of look out for more and more, is the unused space, the possibility that exists in cities to insert nature in, and how innovative people can be in slotting it back in, and how much that desire has always existed amongst urban dwellers, is to live amongst greenery. It's always been the dream, going back to the Hanging Gardens of Babylon and through to the Rome of Nero, or the Mughal gardens of Indian cities in the 16th century and what have you, or the kind of garden squares of London, or the creation of Central Park, or whatever those stories are. There's always been this very kind of almost utopian, but certainly ideological, heavily sort of politicized and aesthetic desire to live with nature in cities. And it's always been a kind of dream, I think. It was a big part of the kind of development of American cities as well, was to be different from European cities, and to have a cities that balanced nature and urbanism much more from the very beginning of kind of American urbanization. And it's one that we should sort of stick true to, really, and find ways of constantly reinventing. That we have ages where parks were kind of the antidotes to slum living. Now we should have sort of trees and vegetation as a kind of way that encourages people to live in cities and come back to cities and find pleasure and joy in them, and places where you can bring up families and connect them with nature whilst having the best of both worlds. However we try and do that, we've tried it in many, many different ways. Suburbanization was one of them.
What's been the reaction to the book so far, in terms of folks thinking about cities, urban greening, everything related to the things that you talk about?
Well, I think sometimes you're preaching to the converted when you write books like this, so you get a lot of support, sort of generally people who are quite in favor of it. I've yet to have any kind of serious negative reaction. I think some people might think, it's utopian, it's pie in the sky. If you don't like cities, you don't like you kind of see cities as the problem. That's one reaction, I think, is that the cities are sort of remorselessly kind of destroying nature and not creating it. So for people who reject cities, it's an argument sometimes falls on deaf ears a little bit. I'm a kind of realist in this kind of thing, that cities can and should exist. They are a way of, by people living more densely and more sustainably, that's a good thing, surely, and that that cities aren't always the problem, that the argument should be with containing, not wishing cities away. I think another reaction has been to share and to get people to see their cities in a different way. And I think lots of people I've spoken to have begun to notice things growing in their cities much, much more, and to appreciate what they see growing and to notice it where they hadn't done before. So I think that's been a really, really nice reaction. The other thing is that I've got some reactions have been quite interesting, that there's a lot of people, there's a big movement for companies in general, businesses, to offset their emissions with rewilding projects. And some of the danger is that there's a lot of greenwashing that goes on, and an attempt to find sort of quick and easy solutions, or things that look like they're natural and doing good things. So there is an interesting kind of way that the corporate world sort of tries to sort of piggyback on these kind of things and kind of bend them to their needs. But actually, you kind of lose the kind of spontaneity and community aspect, because at the end of the day, this should be about communities and how they decide for themselves what kind of nature they want and how they innovate, and what kind of environment they want to live in. That's really, I think, always been, to my mind, and writing this book, because a lot of this book is about resistance as well. It has been resistance to the way that cities have been changed, and change has been forced on people, and green spaces have been taken away from people, and the kind of nature they want. So a lot of the book is about how people have had to sort of try and sort of do things for themselves. So So I worry about it being taken away from people, because this should be a kind of common endeavor, not a kind of corporate kind of way of kind of greenwashing and kind of covering up
Yeah.
their crime. But
Yeah.
that was an interesting response actually to the book. And one I hadn't anticipated was the way that you kind of get a sort of people trying to sort of use these ideas for their own kind of less than pure ends. So sort of cynicism about it, which was kind of something I hadn't anticipated, but maybe is the sign that attitudes are changing in some strange way.
The other question I have for you is, I imagine that you've been talking about your book and thinking about it for a long time, obviously, but is there something in the book that you don't get asked about that you wish you could talk about more?
That's a really good question. I think one of the things that I found really interesting, but maybe it's just a personal interest, is what happens on the kind of the edge of cities as cities grow and change and push out and expand. And I found that kind of that liminal zone, that kind of the boundary between city and countryside, or city and wilderness, or city and sea, or city, city and jungle, whatever it happens to be, a really interesting place where, and historically really interesting, that process of urbanization as cities have pushed outwards from their sort of original cores, their sort of dense centers into countryside, is a really interesting process. But maybe I'm just sort of that's something that's personally interesting to me.
I think it's really interesting, especially in light of what's happening here in California, where some insurance companies have recently decided not to insure houses because of the wildfires on the wildland urban interface, right? So we're getting closer and closer to nature on the edges and the forests and things. And the insurance companies are like, nope, we're not gonna support that. And so there's that tension between the edges, right? That's really, really interesting.
And what effect will that have? That will stop people getting mortgages, presumably.
Yeah, because if you can't get insurance, the mortgage companies won't allow you to get a mortgage. And so you either have to pay in cash to build a house and then hope that it doesn't burn down and have to build another one, or the state is going to have to pick up the slack in some form or fashion, which that's a lot of money and political face that people are going to have to either save or push off. So it's super interesting.
And the same will happen to coasts, I would imagine. I think the insurance, and people will stop insuring people, because coastal urbanism has been a huge thing, and has been really consequential, I think, for an ecosystem we don't talk about very much, which is the coastal ecosystem, which is the source of a lot of life and are very, very important for the interaction between land and sea, and very important for the global kind of environment. But we like to push down to the coast, whether it's in Dubai or Lagos or Mumbai, where reclaim land from the sea. And surely the same effect will happen on that edge as well, that very important edge,
especially sea level rise, right? Like just the managed retreat that needs to happen, and that's another insurance thing. Like you said, it's Florida, whether they're going to backfill all the insurance that's going to disappear or not, and what that's going to do to the state budgets and things like that is amazing. There's a stat in the book that I found really interesting related to this topic as well, is that 2/3 of urban land will have been built since 2000 by 2030. And so if you think about how much we will build in the future to get to that point of 2/3 of what's being built by 2030, that's a lot of building, and that's a lot of resource extraction. That's a lot of edge city construction, right? And so I just thought that was really fascinating. And it's a stat that I've heard before in numerous different ways. People say by 2050 or 2060, we haven't seen most of the things that have been built yet, but that is also scary to a certain extent to me.
Yeah, it's really scary, because a lot of where that urbanization is happening is in biodiversity hotspots around the world, in Africa and Asia, places which are hugely important for the life of the planet, and how we urbanize on those edges, because we want urbanization to happen. So how the edge of the city interacts with the ecosystem it's going into is really, really important. And I think the cities have always done it quickly and without thinking on, the kind of expansion of any major city in Europe or the United States or wherever hasn't been that concerned with the edges. It's taken sort of maybe a little bit of interest and preserved a bit, but it hasn't done it in a very systematic or thought through way. And I think, if the climate emergency is as dire as we think, then the battle will transfer to the edges of cities. It's where wildfires happen, where flooding happens and things like that. So urbanizing on the edge is really, really important. And I think there's a huge opportunities there as well to have a kind of more dense form of urbanization, which preserves patches and corridors of nature on their edges, which is surely a much better way of doing it. And those edges will be the ramparts of the city, ramparts that once defended cities against invading armies. But those edges will become the ramparts that defend against natural, disasters and emergencies and things like that. So we would do really well to think much more intensely about the edge zone of a city, because it is really important. And it's interesting if the market dynamics and future events have their say and to turn out to be much more important than our conscious planning, which would probably be within the tradition of the history of cities, of sort of confronting disaster and being shaped by them and responding to them. Is probably, when you look at the bigger scheme of cities, whether it's wars or recessions or diseases or pandemics, whatever it happens to be, cities have always been shaped by disasters as much as they have been by their successes. So that's, that could be yet to be a kind of, a future for our urbanizing planet. But I think, whether you like it or not, whether you're kind of into this or not, I think it will intrude more and more into our lives and our politics, the way that cities and nature interact, that we got away with it for a long time. But I think those days are over. Whether we want to think about it or we don't, it will be something that we have to confront, like the Dutch, who live in their sort of low-lying country, but have learned to deal with the sort of the threat of nature, the threat of what, badly managed urbanization can do. And they've done it in an innovative and very necessary kind of way.
Make way for the river.
Yeah.
So the book is Urban Jungle, The History and Future of Nature in the City. Ben Wilson, where can folks get a copy if they want to buy one?
Well, all good bookshops. Online retailers, of which there are several. You can read it as an ebook. But yeah, ask your local bookstore, support your local bookstore is what I would say.
Well, Ben, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
That's been loads of fun. Thank you so much.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and published first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our wonderful Patreon supporters for sponsoring this week's show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. Find us at patreon.com/theoverheadwire. And you can sign up for our 16-year-old newsletter at theoverheadwire.com. And you can also listen to our show on your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. And if you can't find it there, you can always find its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.